Well, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. Hi, Commissioner Gold. Can you hear us okay? Okay. So I've kicked it off on my end. And just a reminder, we have mics in the ceiling. So please speak up for all of us commissioners and council and mayor so that folks online can hear us.
Great. Well, I need to go ahead and call our meeting to order. So I don't know if there's somebody that calls the roll or we just recognize that we're all here. We have a quorum. Great. All right. We are convened.
Perfect. So I guess I'll just kick things off and just say that this was a, request by I think both agencies to get a better sense of where the city is at and the plans and work that you've done and with Vision Zero. And I'm excited to have a presentation from Bree. And is it all right if we, obviously this is a very different style, work session style. So we're good to just pepper you with questions, Bree?
Please do.
Thank you for being here.
I feel like I need a little booster up here, though your podiums are a little taller than ours at City Hall. And these slides should be up. Okay, great. So like President Pickering said, I'm here to share the work that our Vision Zero Task Force did in 2021 and 2022 to hopefully prepare you all for a discussion on how the Commission and Council partner to address traffic safety. First, I'll start by sharing how the group came to be, and then I'll go into a little bit more specifics of the framework that they used. Okay, so the first time we saw Vision Zero mentioned as an initiative for the city was in our Transportation Action Plan in 2016. Safety for All was identified as one of the top 6 initiatives that the city's action plan could take on, and adopting a Vision Zero framework was one of the program-based steps we hope to take on to create safer roads. And adopting such a policy was also a recommendation on our bicycle-friendly city status with the League of American Cyclists. So it's something we've heard over the years, and then in 2021, it really became a priority to help the city develop an action plan to reduce serious injury and death on our streets and really identify what things we could realistically do and where we might need to partner with others. So here you'll see the group that we had tasked, probably a lot of familiar faces, a lot of advocates in the community, representing different sectors, and of course, some neighborhood representation as well. And as the group met, one of the first things that emerged was the term Vision Zero has really evolved to now reflect approach rather than the goal. So the reason why it's on your agenda listed as Vision Zero Safe Systems is because this is sort of the new framework we're thinking about this as. Vision Zero is the goal, creating safe systems is how we'll be able to get there. And a little bit more about that framework. This is the guiding principles that that task force used and that how we at the City of Boise have really thought about this. One of the key principles of safe systems, people make mistakes. People will make mistakes and human error is inevitable, but our system can be designed to accommodate those inevitable mistakes, and those mistakes don't have to end up being fatal or cause serious incapacitating injuries. And I think the example I gave to council when they first started discussing this as an initiative was something everybody knows as standard practice on interstate highways, a rumble strip. Rumble strips came about in the early 1950s with no other purpose than to alert drivers who are drowsy, drifting off the road, knocking them back in. Very normal design principle today that was used to do just this, accommodate human error. And then one of the second principles here you'll see is people are vulnerable. The human body only has so many limits for tolerating crashes, and I think this is something we can think about very simply. The faster a crash occurs at, the higher likelihood it is to be fatal or serious. And then safety is proactive. The safe systems approach is relying on a systemic view of the system, so not just what intersection is problematic, but what are components of that intersection that exist across the entire system. Where do we see those same conditions across multiple intersections, not just that one spot that looks like trouble. Okay, so we had this guiding principle, we had the charge from council, and we have a great group. The next important piece was to look at the data. We enlisted the support of the Idaho Policy Institute to do a crash analysis from 2005 to 2020. And it broke out in great detail, pretty much everything you can see in a police report, everything that would be reported back to ITD or LTAC for cause of a crash, driver age, which direction they were turning, were they in the intersection, were they in the bike lane? We had just so much data, and one of the products we got from it was a dashboard, and I'll show a clip of that in a second. But these are a few of the things that really stood out to the group. Some things you might expect, like crashes occurring in typical peak hours. The age of drivers tending to be young, 18 to 28, in the 27% range. And then one I found the most interesting here was 38% of pedestrian crashes are occurring while the pedestrian was walking in a crosswalk.
Before you move on, so fatal crashes, is that including car on car, pedestrian in car,
yes,
bike car?
This 125 number is car, pedestrian, any crash that occurred on the roadway that police responded to.
Is this Boise specific data?
Councilmember, sorry, Madam Mayor.
Oh, sorry.
Councilmember Woodings. Yes, it is Boise specific.
And then what do you mean by incapacitating crashes?
Something that's considered a life-altering injury.
Thank you. Commissioner Goldthorpe.
Madam President, another question. Is there anything that's broken out to show that the crashes were caused by a drunk? You know, there wasn't something you could peg on road design or things like that.
Absolutely, Commissioner Goldthorpe. That is part of the dashboard. You can see like what the contributing circumstances are, and one of them is driving under the influence. A part of that dashboard is a map, and there's a link to this on our website, but I can send it out afterward as well. I would have pulled it up today, but it's slow to upload all of the data. So I just stuck this out here. This is 2016 to 2020, and a map of all of the fatal and incapacitating crashes. You can go through the dashboard and see what road classification it was. Sometimes you can see what the speed was on the road. But here you just see general, here's where they happen, and here were the leading causes, or event, I should say. This is not the contributing factors.
So Bree, just point out that when we did this data, it became pretty obvious that there's a lot of crashes on our major arterials. Not a big surprise, but I think it just reinforced that. An interesting factoid, and thank you ACHD for working with the city on the design of Whitewater Park Boulevard. There were no fatal, no incapacitating, and only 2 or 3 small crashes on Whitewater Park Boulevard. It's the safest 5-lane arterial in the region, as far as we could tell. So just an idea about the kinds of treatments that would work. And even on that, we hear that people feel like the traffic's moving too fast, but at least there haven't been any bad crashes.
And Bree, I'm kind of getting hung up on the column on the right with most harmful event, because I would assume rear ends, and the data isn't demonstrating that it is the most harmful in terms of percentage of fatal versus incapacitating. So are those just, I don't know if that could just be retitled to frequency versus most harmful, because it's kind of, right? I mean,
Sure, yes, absolutely. President Pickering, this is some of the language that's cited on police reports, because that's how they record it, and that's how it's reported back. So when you say most harmful event, we're taking what they have cited as the primary cause of the crash and not maybe other contributing factors. So let's say rear end is the most harmful event. Contributing cause could be following too closely. So there's 2 different things there, and most harmful event. And what you're seeing here is for pedestrians.
because I would think that since that has the highest percentage of fatal
Yeah.
crashes, that should be first, right?
No,
That's
no.
what I'm, that's
No,
what I'm
this
kind of
is,
curious.
we are using the designations that the incident reports use. So that's their language, so we're not gonna change it because we're keeping data. But rear end means they were called for an accident that was primarily a rear end accident.
Mm-hmm.
Pedestrian means they were called for an accident where a pedestrian was hit, or where a pedal cycle was hit, or a head-on turning event was the event that caused the accident.
Yeah, and if you're having a hard time differentiating between incapacitating and fatal, you can see, I don't know if this is a pointer, for pedestrian, when a pedestrian is involved in a crash, most of the time you're seeing fatal crashes happen with pedestrians. So you have a smaller red bar for rear ends. That's not going to result in a fatality as often as it will when a pedestrian is involved in a harmful event.
And I have a question about incapacitating. Is that like forever, or somebody is in the crosswalk, they get hit and they have like a broken leg for a while?
Madam Mayor, that definition's hard to say. I'm not sure what the standard definition is. Life-altering is usually considered like, long-term disability causing. But maybe like breaking is just incapacitating or minor injury.
Commissioner Hanson.
Madam President and Madam Mayor, I just think it's interesting that the three that have that no fatalities are parked cars, concrete barriers, and sideswiped, because there's a physical, protection. Of course, the car itself is providing physical protection, so
Yeah. And
concrete barriers can be.
President Pickering, on other parts of this dashboard, you can layer in other things like the contributing circumstance, and that makes the column on the right make a little bit more sense. So I'm definitely going to get you the link, and then you can kind of play around with it yourself and see how the most harmful event changes depending on what other factors you're layering in to look at.
Well, and just a observation, my district encompasses Fairview, and it's really jarring to see how many crashes are on Fairview and comparing that just to that snippet of State Street.
Sure.
And that's really telling.
This is something we looked at as well when we were looking at really the difference between U-Stick and Fairview, the difference in types of crashes. If you think about the conditions on Fairview, you have a lot of front-on businesses with drive access directly onto the arterial. You also allow left turns from exiting those. So you have people making left turns maybe across 3 lanes of traffic. So it's not terribly surprising.
Commissioner Hanson?
Do you have time of day data on all this too?
Absolutely.
That'd be very helpful because it'd be interesting to see what time of day some of these have.
And Commissioner Hanson, when you get the link to the portal, you can click on each one and see what time of day it was. And one of the other tabs is intersection lighting, and we saw that crashes that happen after dark tend to be more DUIs. Crashes that happen during the daytime are less likely to have that element. But there wasn't really any correlation between we're seeing more crashes when there are no lights in the intersection. That didn't pan out. And then this is the same map, just showing non-incapacitating, so maybe a less serious injury, possible injuries, and then property damage. Pretty similar. You can see Fairview sticking out as one that has a lot of non-incapacitating, but this just shows you that rear ends still tend to be one of the biggest car crashes we see.
Another point on this one, as a culture, we value property damage highly, and if you're a pedestrian or a bike, the property damage is probably pretty low in that crash, and so in a lot of ways that we analyze crashes, it doesn't rise to the top. So that's another thing that we recognize you kind of have to pay attention to.
Commissioner Hanson, Goldthorpe, sorry.
In 2015, when we were considering putting a median all the way down Fairview from Orchard to Meridian. We tore this data apart like nobody's business now in 2015, but we did discover that those rear enders were the prevalent thing. There had been very few relative to the rear enders, other types of collisions. And I don't even remember if at that point in time there'd been a fatality for all the years we considered on Fairview. So, but there is a continuing access problem.
Mm-hmm. And President Pickering, Commissioner Goldthorpe, that might be an updated consideration if you look at what's been done since 2016. How has it changed? What new businesses have arrived on the corridor? What new access points have arrived on the corridor? That might be helpful to look at. Okay, and then finally getting into the group's recommended strategies and timeline. We have made our way through some of those immediate ones. City Council endorsed Vision Zero via resolution probably about a year ago, almost to the day. And the goal was to explore strategies that the city could implement to reduce crashes by 50% by 2030 was their stated goal. And then we didn't end up working on some of these with you all because you worked on it already without any partnership. Example, the bike lane delineators, really waiting for the results from you all on the Maple Grove project. When this was drafted, that was going on. So that's why that didn't come to you in any other way. And then we did develop a webpage to share information about the city's commitment to Vision Zero. And now we're starting to move into some of these other ones, creating neighborhood traffic safety toolkits, targeting what is traditionally the education component of Vision Zero, one of the 5 E's to tackle traffic safety. And then working through these other ones will be really interesting because as many of you heard at Compass yesterday, they were awarded a $400,000 Safe Streets for All planning grant. And I had borrowed a slide from their presentation with their permission to show a little bit of the process that we'll go through. This plan may not be underway for another 7 months. So I'm showing this to hopefully get you thinking about what we'll see in this plan, but also what things we might want to do before then. Getting at the regional vision and goals for transportation safety, engaging stakeholders, doing this data-driven analysis that we've started some of the work for, and identifying proven countermeasures, things that you all are already starting to identify, leading pedestrian intervals, testing out the different types of delineator materials, things like that. So this will be really good because once this plan is established, anybody in the community, anybody in the region, any entity can go apply for the money. One of the caveats of applying for this funding pool was you had to have a plan first before you started going for the implementation grants where you could actually do some of the work. Next steps, participating in that, in developing that regional safety action plan. You all were very engaged in that process when they submitted the grant and got the scope ready. So now that that scope is ready to go, they're going to get it out the door and start doing the agreements necessary to get the planning underway by the end of the year. We'll continue to work through the strategies we identified through the task force and then seek your direction and partnership on approaches that can balance those quick wins with long-term systemic changes.
One of the things that I've been thinking is you guys have moved forward on a couple of the bike lane delineator projects, and I know that you've worked with our staff on a number of other ones.
I could just speak up a little bit.
That's right. Sorry, I forget that the mics are up there. Number of other ones, and it would be. I wonder in this time frame when we're waiting for the regional plan to really get going, if we could move forward on some more of those and use that as a way to collect data. If you put those delineators in or curbing or whatever it is we do on those routes, do you improve safety and increase use? And that data then could feed into the plan so we can see more of those if they're successful. For instance, so on that last one, I hope that It doesn't mean we wait for the plan to start doing stuff.
I lost my clicker access, but if I could go back to one of the slides that talks about a long-term goal, which I think is really doable with your partnership, is before and after studies of corridors that you're doing these things on. Collister, Kootenai, all the things you're implementing on those streets, being intentional about the data you're collecting through design, and then a few years after implementation, a process for what are we looking at on the corridor after we did this design. So really, I think a really easy thing to do.
So my question for you, Bree, and Council, Madam Mayor, is how did you use the data that you shared with us to inform your project priorities for the integrated 5-year work plan? How was that process?
Sure. Council, or I'm messing that up today. President Pickering, the data that we saw through this process doesn't change too much of the things we're asking for. It does show where we might prioritize things differently. We are hoping for the same thing: people-friendly streets, better safety for pedestrians and cyclists, protected bike lanes. These are all things that we've always been really excited about, but I think it's helped us change the order of things and see that maybe improvements to downtown streets should have a little bit higher priority. We see a higher density of crashes that are fatal, things like that. We're changing the order of where things are prioritized, not so much the things we're asking for. I think to change the things we would ask for and see in projects and make better informed design comments, that would be something we would love to work on, and a toolkit of things that we could use in Boise projects that reflect this. But it really just changes the priority and the importance of projects.
Let me read, Madam Mayor, President Pickering, if I could maybe add to that just a little bit. I think a lot of the things that we're requesting are types of things that you see incorporated in Division 0 planning. And so those projects don't really change, but trying to figure out like what the universal policy changes, I think, are where we're trying to get at a little bit more, so that we're not just looking at these one-off projects and saying, this is what we want to see here, this is what we want to see here, here's a spot where we're addressing an issue. It's kind of more saying like, here's a spot where we're seeing an issue. Now, we know that there's a problem at this particular, let's say it's an intersection. What are the 95 other intersections around the Treasure Valley that have this exact same problem? And how can we be working with ACHD to have shared policies that would make sure that any intersection that we're looking, if we can address it at this one particular area, or if we have data showing that there's fatalities and crashes at these particular types of intersections, that we duplicate it when we implement it across the board. And like, just to put maybe a finer point on that, and maybe an example, is one of the things that we know when we're looking at fatalities is that speed kills. And so we have to figure out ways where we re-examine how we're looking at speed and how we're deciding what speed's going to be in areas where there's potentially higher pedestrian activity, and not just using an old formula that might be a great tool to like as a whole, but doesn't actually pinpoint the different areas, and trying to figure out where those pinpoints or the work that you've been doing with like the leading pedestrian intervals. We know that this is a policy that can make it easier for somebody to be seen and potentially increases the time in which this person has to get across the crosswalk. You know, when I was in my walker a few weeks ago, and I'm sure the mayor is experiencing this right now, it's pretty darn hard to get across some of these intersections when you're moving a little bit slower. So what are the policy changes when we're evaluating the speed in which somebody crosses a crosswalk, or the leading pedestrian interval, and the time that can add? And so finding those policies, those sort of broader types of things, so that it's not just the projects we're recommending, but it's kind of every project that goes in, if that makes sense.
Commissioner Hanson?
I couldn't agree more with President Pickering and Councilmember Halliburton. I think it's really critical, and we're discovering in this policy evaluation that President Pickering has initiated that there are some inconsistencies that we're trying to work this out. We actually have developed, and this is one of my questions to Bree or to all of you, is how have you started to use this tool that we've now developed called livable streets performance measures or level of traffic stress, so that there are, if these things are present, then the way in which pedestrian or cyclists will experience this is going to be level 1, 2, 3, 4. And that we then can say, we want to achieve level of traffic stress 1 in this context. And so then what do we need to do? We have to have vertical elements, we have a shorter crossing distance, and so forth. And what we've discovered, is that we construct facilities with two things in mind. With a road facility, especially an arterial, and many collectors, the whole vision in which it was created was to move traffic. And so it's how is the driver viewing that? So it's an arterial. This is how a driver can view this. So they enter it, and the next traffic light isn't for half a mile, so that we're giving them all the signals that they have to focus in the distance. They don't have to worry about what's happening nearby. When in fact nearby, and I think this describes Fairview quite well, is a lot of pedestrian and bicycle activity and people crossing. But what we've done is we've given them signals to say focus in the distance, and it's easy to then, especially in a non-peak, to accelerate. We're doing the reverse for pedestrians. We're saying, okay, you can cross here. Here's a signal, here's something you can do a push button. The classic example was on Ustick, where we created a crossing right in the middle of a block to a church that a child was crossing to. We were giving them the signal, it's safe to cross here any time of day. They pushed the button, crossed the street, but those two signals, one to the driver that you can go as fast as you want on this stretch, and one to the pedestrian that you can safely cross here, led to a fatality. And sadly, both families now live with that for the rest of their lives. So that's trying to work out how do we make those mesh, so that we don't create conflicting signals in both places. And part of, I think, what our struggle is to figure out how to then, as places change, the urban environment downtown, activity centers like up at Push and Pour on the bench, as activity centers change, how do we then change the signals that drivers and pedestrians are getting, so that they're consistent, so that a driver says, okay, I've been on this road, I haven't had to expect pedestrians. Now I do. So what are the physical things that are telling them? I think the delineators on Maple Grove are a little tiny start towards that. This is what you can expect. There's a school here. There's going to be a lot of children, a lot of activity, but we have to figure out something in our policies so that there's consistency and there isn't this sort of argument of, oh my gosh, if we do this, then we'll delay traffic, or if we do this, then nobody's going to invest in this area because it's just going to be too unsafe.
Madam Mayor, President Green, that's a really great comment, Jim. And I think one of the things we're exploring as a city right now with our zoning code rewrite are those very questions. People are asking to be able to walk to things. And so how do we design our city to respond to those wants and needs and this future that people in Boise envision? And how do we have a transportation system that also respects that future vision for Boise, where people are able to walk on some of their daily errands and maybe they're not having to get into their cars for every single thing. So it's a really interesting nexus, and I'm glad you brought that up.
I might just follow up. There's a lot of areas in the old parts of town that it's so well connected, but as a result, people do use them to cut through to avoid traffic on others. And so they need to be given a signal that this is also a neighborhood and that they can't exceed the speed limit of 20 or 25 miles an hour. So we have an old system where we leave it up to the neighborhood to go and collect the signatures on a petition. So the burden is on them to make their neighborhood safe. And yet we don't apply that for the burden on, other traffic infrastructure that might be needed. So that's a big thing, that a policy change that would be very helpful on collector streets, local streets especially, where you do experience speeding. The Nez project is a classic example where it's just designed to go fast, and a lot of people to avoid Overland take Nez, but they're driving by a school and it's a bus route, and there's lots of stuff going on there. So it's not consistent with what Overland's designed for, so they need to know that by the way that street's designed. But our policies, we're taking so long to do that. We're doing Kootenai this year because Kootenai got their act together. That neighborhood's much better organized, got a signature, got a petition. As you know, the demographics of the Nez Perce neighborhood is very different. But fortunately, we're going to be finally addressing the exact same kind of concerns that we addressed. But we do need a policy. I think I agree with Jimmy. We need a policy change so that we don't treat those disparately.
Commissioner Goldthorpe?
Sorry.
We could probably change the wording on our policy, but I would remind the commission that it's been a couple of years since we required a neighborhood to do what Jim alluded to. We have been using the neighborhood's opinions and requests and the 5-year work plan and other means that make their wants happen quicker. And it hasn't been that we want them to do what used to happen 5, 6, 8 years ago. We're not doing that any longer.
Actually, we are.
Madam Mayor.
So I think this is all really interesting to me because I envisioned that ultimately we'd have a policy that would talk about what happens in new development, what happens on capital projects, how do we identify the places that need fixed today and figure out how to prioritize those, whether they be roadway projects or pedestrian projects or bikeway, whatever. The third thing that we haven't, I don't think, thought a lot about, and the zoning code rewrite has really highlighted it, is what is the appropriate role and the appropriate time for ACHD to comment to us on a development application more comprehensively than at the plat level and 1 or 2 little things, right around the development or adjacent to the development. So, it might be a 3-step policy: new development, projects fixing places that are already built, but then what happens when new development comes at a place that's already built to get us closer to where we want to be long range.
I think Bree had something to say.
Oh, yes, Madam Mayor, Council President, that was actually a better intro than I could have given. Our modern zoning code will change the way people interact with the streets, will change the way people relate to the streets. These new developments, the changes in where we're focusing on the growth, those are all things that change the way people interact with your facilities. And we try to take into account where existing facilities exist, but like the Council President said, what changes, what comments can we get from ACHD that support the types of changes we're seeing and the types of impact we expect these to have?
So Madam Mayor, I think to kind of respond to your point, Elaine, I think when you guys presented just the high level zoning code rewrite and the structure of that, I'm gonna butcher the name, but that meeting before, right? And having ACHD staff be part of that meeting, I think is an amazing no-brainer to me. And so I would just say we are on the same page. We want to be able to coordinate and understand where, because we see those issues too at the commission, where it's like, oh, it went through this process and then we all are realizing that this isn't the right fit for whatever reason, or we have to fix something after delays or waiver of policy, right? All of those things, and that it can delay the whole process, and that's not what we want to contribute to or be a part of as well. So I would just say that back to you is, if you can provide your initial thoughts or ideas of how we can be better or be more efficient in that, and where staff could participate in coordination with your work, I think you leading that conversation would be beneficial. And then we can work through, is that the right time? Does that jive with our policies? And we can respond accordingly. So I think if you can take the initiative on that would be great.
Well, and Madam Chair, that's the intention. And right now in the modern zoning code proposal is an early meeting. It creates predictability for neighborhoods and residents. It creates predictability for developers, and it also would limit the amount of times that we're played off of each other as different agencies. that has got to go through the steps before something is fully brought to you all. So it'll be in front of planning and zoning in April and then council in June. It's out right now. And I understood correctly at the last meeting, our staff had said, yes, this was a proposal, but of course they would work with your staff to make sure that it worked for everybody moving forward. Once it is, our staff gets the nod that yes, this is the direction that planning and zoning and council would go.
Madam Mayor, President Pickering, I think this is a really good conversation. I think that it helps us put some of these policies and recommendations into place. But I also think it's a little bit separate than Vision Zero. I think it's communication kind of around the zoning code and the way that we work together to find commonality. I think with Vision Zero, and when I look at that bullet point of partnering with ACHD, to me, it's really sort of figuring out like what are the existing policies that you have that are really, really good, that sort of add to this that are identified. So like the level of stress and the things that we've already been working on with bikeways is like a really great example. Upcoming policies that you're already planning on, like the leading pedestrian interval, and then new shared policies that we're sort of exploring together, and then also exploring as Compass builds out a little bit of this plan and other things that we can be working on. But then I also think that the final part really is that dashboard of taking all of those things together, putting them in the same place, and then when you implement them, measuring whether or not they're effective, and if you're moving the needle in the right direction. And hey, we've done this in this area and it makes sense and it's reducing the issues that we've seen. The example that we've talked about most recently is 11th State Street, where there was a recent fatality. If we can implement something there, and if we can see that it has the effect that we need, that it makes it easier for us to then say, we need to apply these same effects to other areas. And so I think that that's kind of what my hope is that there is sort of a shared effort to combine the systems that you're already working on, the systems that we want to see, and that they're in a location where we can measure the progress that they're making that can inform us, yes, we need to do this faster, or no, this actually didn't have the effect that we thought it was going to have, if that makes sense.
So Bree, I think what would help me, could we go back to the slide with like your timeline?
Maybe.
Because I think piggybacking off of that comment, I want to know like what's next and how can we start working together on this. And obviously there's so many facets of this, right? You're talking about systems, you're talking about existing deficiencies, retrofitting or projects that are on deck, right? There's all these different components. So where are we exactly like in this whole time frame?
Sure.
And Bree, I'd also ask you just to delineate as well the different roles of kind of staff engagement and policymaker engagement, because there are great professional teams here at ACHD and at the city that have the expertise, and particularly in this agency, have the expertise to do a lot of this, and then some roles for policymakers to look at policy. So if you take it with that approach, I think it would be helpful, because it's our intention that our teams work together because they're the ones with the most expertise on these things, and then bring us the policy questions that we need to handle.
Sure. Madam Mayor, President Pickering, I think a good example is what you're about to see this afternoon on the commission agenda from Ryan's team, the leading pedestrian interval plan. That's an example of something staff and is now presenting to policymakers. So I'm thinking about that while I'm thinking about this, because we don't want to duplicate any of the work our respective teams are doing, but whatever is learned through this LPI implementation process, maybe there's some things that you learn as you're implementing that we can use to implement things like or develop a high injury network, and to review the speed limit setting process to create alignment. And some of these things can be done together. As far as what city staff will start taking on now and is already working on is the neighborhood traffic safety toolkits. That's sort of our next step. That's the next thing we think we can do as staff without like a high level of policy support. And then
are you working with our staff on that?
We haven't yet. We're starting to develop the toolkit concepts, and then hopefully we'd be able to engage with your staff on things that they would add.
So you're doing that independently and then bringing along our staff?
Yes, we'll start it and then work with your staff on iterations of what they hear from neighborhoods. This is the neighborhood traffic safety toolkits are a tool we hope to push out to the neighborhood associations. Like, in your neighborhood, your speed limits are this, you have this kind of bicycle infrastructure, you have this kind of intersection treatments, things like that, just educational tools. So it is something we feel like we can take all of the plans you have and wrap them up in a way that neighborhood associations can use to inform residents. That's why it's not as iterative a process where we need a ton of input, because it's all already available to us. But something we would need to work really closely with your staff on is, and you in this at the policy level, review speed limit setting process. This came up in the last joint meeting where we talked about speed limits being enforced by design. That's clearly a policymaker role, and something we can work with as staff, but it's really set out in your policy manual. And of course, part of our zoning code efforts, how our built environment reinforces what's happening on the streets. Criteria for installation of right on red, looking out to these 3 to 5 year goals. This is something we would have to work together on, because we have this land use perspective that says, here's where schools are, here's where really high pedestrian environments are. Like, we know that information, and then you all know how the intersection functions for traffic and how it needs to function, and how those two can work together to create maybe some criteria for installation of right on red. And then long-term, I don't think this has to be that long-term, but it is in the 5 to 10 year range because of the before and after component. But creating the standard evaluation template, that's something we do together. We decide like what factors are important to each of us, and how can we create a template now that we know projects will be measured for in the future. I don't know if I as clearly delineated who's on first and where we're starting, but no, we're starting here, working on some messaging to our residents about traffic safety within their own neighborhoods, and then working with you all. Maybe we can get into some of the high injury network map analysis and speed limit setting. But I would yield to you.
Remember, excuse me, remember that we did this internally in the city, and it wasn't, in collaboration with you. As I look at it, I think there's a lot of opportunity to now expand it and broaden the collaboration on some of those projects, especially the neighborhood traffic safety kits. Make sure that they're in line with the policies, and I know that our staff's looking at your policies to develop them, but get you involved in that. Things that aren't on there, for instance, are more in your arena. I think at some point there's probably an update to the Livable Streets Guide, and accompanying that, probably an update to the Master Streets Map. I think one thing that, putting my other hat on for a moment, that doesn't exist well in either organization is good guidance for how and where to put transit stops. We're beginning to develop it, but it's not very standardized yet, so that's another place that could probably have some work.
Madam Mayor, President Pickering, maybe to, I think, answer part of the question that President Pickering asked earlier, I think we're still mostly in that immediate green area, and we haven't moved on a lot from there, and I don't think that it really makes sense for the city, in my opinion, to move on much past there without working really, really closely with ACHD and ACHD staff. And I don't think that it's my role to direct staff to do something. I think that that's really the mayor and the mayor's office. But I think what I would personally love to see is to take some of the work that we've done and some of the data that we've put together already, and while Compass is putting together a more formal plan for the staff, ACHD and City of Boise, to have some sort of work group where they can begin to identify what's already being done, what's working well together, and make sure that we know what each other is working on and kind of what's in the pipeline, and what are some of the other low-hanging fruit, if you will, or some discussions that we need to start together. while that other plan is happening. Because I don't think that we should wait for that plan completely, because it's going to take a long time to get done. It's going to focus on the entire valley, and then people will have to then begin applying for funds. And it would sure be nice to know what we might be wanting to apply for funds, earlier on while we're getting even more data. And so I guess that's what I would love to see, is the staff working together who has more expertise than I think most of us at this table. No offense,
Absolutely, all of it.
to begin to identify what some of these other things might be, and then bringing them in front of the groups, decide if these are things that we would want to go for. I guess that's what I envision. But again, I think it's up to the entire group, and certainly up to the mayor's office on how we would want to direct staff.
Well, and I agree with you. I think that makes a lot of sense. And this was what, we started this 1.5 years, 2 years ago, looking at, because of the leadership of the two of you wanting to look at safe streets and Vision Zero. And, I'd say it's up to ACHD commission members now, because I would want our teams to collaborate. And we've agreed to direct staff to do that. And so if this is something that the commission wants your team to be working on as well, then we've got it going. And they can take off from the yellow onward to get these things done and to bring to us what needs to be brought to us.
Commissioner Goldthorpe?
It's been decided that we're going to allow our staff to take more risks and innovate a little bit without fear of us or anybody else in this agency. And so I would suggest and expect that as our staff works with you guys, they will see opportunities to make decisions, and we will see opportunities to support.
Before Commissioner answers, one quick comment. So I think also, yes, absolutely, Madam Mayor, and I think not to repeat the whole neighborhood traffic safety toolkits, I think that's something that I've noticed with my neighborhood associations, that they really need that type of information. But I think the more that we can have our staff part of those conversations and those partnership opportunities as early as possible, it makes the most sense, because they're going to know whether or not things like that actually get in. If you have an issue or something like that, oh yeah, well, this is what it is on paper, but there's these other actual ways to get that problem solved in a variety of other ways, right? So I think that even though you guys have that information already, having us be part of that as soon as possible and apply that to everything else is going to be key. And then also, we've been, made, in addition to Commissioner Goldthorpe's point with our staff, we've had some really big progress with our own efforts as well. So with the LPI, I don't know if you guys saw the mini sweeper out front. We've got 2 other ones that are coming. And so I think just the more that we can also share what we're working on and how that also impacts and benefits your vision, I think it's again, we want it to be both ways. And that's what we hope to achieve as well.
Well,
Sure,
President,
did you have something else?
2 things. One is a lot of the ideas that we're working on were generated through conversations, discussions in our advisory committees. They're tremendously valuable. The 4 commissioners who are here regularly attend and listen in, and they talk about the exact same neighborhoods that you're representing. So that is a really good source of those kind of ongoing discussions. And I'm not too sure, but figure out ways in which your staff, you can sort of understand where we may be going on that. A lot of the discussions about whether the 85th percentile, it really makes sense anymore, or it makes sense in certain contexts, is going on in those advisory groups. Access management was raised by a neighborhood. The whole access management stuff was raised by a neighborhood, and then we found it in several other places, was whether that conflict in policy. Crossing distances, crossing intervals. Does that make sense in some contexts? How do we weigh those? We also you have the neighborhood toolkit, but we also have our neighborhood plans. We go through a very comprehensive process of updating our neighborhood plans, and that should be in there. They should be using those tools. And of course, then the reality is that not all neighborhood associations are in a position to do that. And so then the reality is, for several neighborhoods, I just sort of step in and help them. And sometimes it's a different person every time because they're not as, they're all volunteers. Some of them, like Barber Valley, oh my gosh, they're like structured and they meet and oh my God, they got officers, and others don't. So how do you make sure that it's not this imbalance where we've given a toolkit and the ones who are best prepared can use it, and those who perhaps really need it, how do we make sure that that balance takes place? So those are the two things that put sort of place in your think about how you interact with our advisory committees and how do we strengthen our neighborhood association outreach or even provide some equity between neighborhoods.
President Pickering, Commissioner Hanson, as we start putting these together, we know who those neighborhoods are we don't hear from very much, and we know who the ones we hear from the most. But we also enjoy really open communication with your staff. We have a monthly, regularly scheduled meeting where we can bring little things like this or bigger things and talk through things like that. So we have the forum to discuss them and can bring them along the way.
I agree. We have Director. Did we want to present on your guide right now, or was that later?
After your presentation.
Okay, cool.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Anything else?
I would just say, so this was Bree's presentation on Vision Zero. If there are things, particular takeaways that you envisioned out of this presentation, now's a good time to share them. We've had a great conversation back and forth throughout it. But I hope that you heard and Bree heard that there's opportunity for staff to work together. This is where we're at. It sounds like you guys have some things to work on as a commission today that then would be right for a joint conversation between the two agencies or report back.
Mm-hmm.
But I just ask, before we wrap up, if there's more you all would like to see or know, or if there are particular steps you'd like our team to start taking with yours to get some of this moving.
I'm processing your question. I think initially, so just to recap, so ACHD, our commission, we completed a policy retreat several weeks ago, and we did some inventory of some, highly requested overlapping policies that we've seen from all different types of folks that were asking us to take a look at. So we'll be structuring a review of those said policies into several buckets, and those are ranging from access management, to requesting traffic calming or project retrofit. So I think your point about how do we address new development versus existing, like those pieces were very much conversations that we had at that retreat. So I think, because I'm thinking of okay, how do we operationalize and move forward at the commission level, is that we'll be presenting and having work sessions on those various policy potential amendments. And so what I would like to just see and have is your guys' involvement, whether that's testifying or coming to a work session saying, hey, this is where we're seeing this conflict or how this could provide a solution to feed into Vision Zero, or this supports or doesn't support this, as well as our zoning code rewrite, right, that's coming. I think having much more of a direct presence of you all giving us input on these policy decisions would be helpful. And that's how I'm thinking of initially operationalizing some of these conversations.
Sure, I have a question. Is it not better to have it sooner than when the commission is weighing it?
Sure, absolutely.
All right. Because in my mind, it makes more sense, just as we're talking about how we streamline the process where our staff talks early in a development application. Mm-hmm. In my mind, at a work session or a commission meeting, for us to send somebody to testify is really too late.
Mm-hmm.
Much better off to have our staff working on it together from the beginning and providing feedback than asking principals to come and tell you at the last minute.
Yep, love it.
Maybe, sorry, Madam Mayor and President Pickering, maybe it's a little bit of both. So really working together in the development of some of these policies, and then when the policy is up for adoption, really showing our support of that adoption and showing our support of the process.
Commissioner Hanson.
And I just want to point out, we actually do have set a precedent with respect to policy updates, which happened a number of years ago with the help of your fire department when we were deciding whether the standard lane width in a local road was consistent. And we actually do have different approaches to Boise than we have with, actually the other cities went along with Boise's approach except Star. So Star prefers wider local roads. So we do have a precedent of saying, this is something that makes sense for Boise. Just because it may not make sense for some of the other cities does not mean we can't change it and apply. I think it makes sense that we have consistent maintenance across the county, but in terms of design features that are really critical to neighborhoods and the land use purposes of each of the cities, there can be some differences in the way we approach design features. So just know that that's not an obstacle. If you say, well, that's the standard, we have to now convince Meridian to go along with it, and Eagle and CUNA and Star and Garden City. That's not necessarily the case. We could approach it differently, and in fact, we could then, show how it works in different cities.
Madam Mayor, President Pickering, I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but I don't think that the city's Vision Zero resolution has any teeth unless ACHD has a similar vision or a similar resolution, whether it's a safe systems or a Vision Zero. I don't know what staff's bandwidth is, and I know that there's a lot of stuff going on, so I don't feel comfortable making recommendations to what staff should do. But I guess my recommendation would be that the city get together with ACHD, that the mayor's office get together, potentially, I guess, with President Pickering or President Pickering and Director Wong, and to figure out what a task force would look like with all the recent deaths and fatalities and injuries that we've had on the road, and trying to put together a formal Vision Zero task force that takes our initial steps, but actually includes ACHD, which would have been stronger to begin with, and figures out what a timeline would actually look like for us to be able to put some of these things forward. Because again, I just don't know that the city's resolution and the city's plan has anything unless it's a joint effort with ACHD at the same time. I think all these other discussions are really, really important. But if we as a city want to move forward with Vision Zero, we got to a certain point, we couldn't go any further, and we need to be working with ACHD in order to do it. So my recommendation would be for us to examine putting forward a task force that consists of our staff who have expertise, as well as some of the people in the community and the neighborhoods that Commissioner Hanson was talking about, and trying to figure out what exactly are the next steps that we would like to move forward in this specific effort. That's what I would like to see.
Commissioner Golder.
And I would think that if our agency and the commission goes this way, that we should probably do it by resolution, not by policy changes, because we're a county-wide district. And what we might be asked to do by the city of Boise will definitely be different than what we're asked to do by Star, but it won't be the same.
In response to you, Jimmy, I think we've got staff partnering with the city of Meridian and West Ada on a task force to evaluate and work through the challenges to reduce crashes amongst all users really in Meridian. So we're already doing that work with one second largest city. So obviously we can work with staff and see what our capacity is, but it makes sense that we're already part of that task force in one city, and I think it would make a lot of sense to do that with another one as well. But obviously we can consider that.
So I like Jimmy's suggestion, figuring out a way if there are other cities in the county who'd want to participate to make sure that you guys don't have to duplicate your efforts. It probably makes perfect sense. I have one policy question that I just like to put on the table because I don't know, I think it was sort of highlighted in the recent development applications off of Vista and Victory. It's long been your policy that you get into deep mitigation and comment at the plat level and not before that final plat comes forward or the preliminary plat comes forward. And there are some places where it makes a lot more sense to look at the overall picture and then dig into the details at the plat level. So as you're reviewing your policies, I hope that that's one that you'll review, figure out what are the thresholds, what are the places where it would be maybe more important to have that first look at the overarching level and then dig in on the specifics at the plat. I appreciate that you guys are doing that work. Thank you. Sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. Sorry.
And thanks for saying that. I can't tell you how many hundred times I've had conversations with developers about that very thing and have asked them with very little success actually, that if they feel like they're coming up against a roadblock or something, to even drop my name when they're talking to staff, or if they really think the roadblock is serious, come to the commission, and they can come to us at any time. And but they don't.
Yeah.
So I have a question, President Pickering and Elaine. So I'm trying to figure out how to operationalize this.
Yeah.
And it's not easy.
No, it isn't.
Because from what I hear in the Vista neighborhood is that in that process, before we were involved, before the preliminary plat, all our staff was like waiting. The messages were given both to the neighborhood and to the city that you can't do this or you can't do that because of ACHD policy. And so certain processes and decisions were made at a certain point. Although the city did push and say, no, I think you can do this. We do have some authority to insist on transportation related conditions. So the city pushed, but I think that was partly because the neighborhood expected the city to push. And that in those places where they didn't, it's just a whole lot of work. If ACHD says, well, our policy applies this way, boom, then that discussion's off the table. And so I'm trying to figure out at what point. I mean, the access management is a good one, on-street parking, counting on-street parking, all kinds of things like that, connectivity. Those are the kinds of things that that neighborhood was concerned about. And that from what I can tell, you guys responded and said, we would like these things. And after some effort, ACHD said, yeah, okay, we'll go along with that.
You're right. It's hard to operationalize. I think if we get out of the specifics and up into the actual policy level, to me, as I've observed it over the years, the policy that drives that behavior, that no, those decisions are already made or they'll be made later, is that we don't have a process early on in especially big development applications to have a joint meeting to talk through what are the things that are going to come up, what are the things that are being asked for, is this a push point that we can push on or not? And so think of it more, not that specific one, but overall, what would the policy be to engage that conversation at the appropriate time so that you could have those meetings, right?
And that, I mean, I'd say that I see that as that first, the initial meeting the modern zoning code is proposing.
Yeah.
Where all the agencies come together so that you don't have the applicants speaking for agencies to the other agency. Yeah.
And the change it requires at ACHD is a recognition that you can make some decisions before you get to the plat level.
So So I'm sure some of you have seen, we rejected the bid for the downtown Boise improvement plan State Street project last week. We have a work session today about how do we move forward, because that's obviously a very important project. Anyway, I don't want to put the cart before the horse, but I think I just would like to plant the seed now that I think that project in particular would be a really great one for us to cut our teeth on in terms of knowing, let's put these principles into practice, and what design pieces would you want to see to make sure that it is in line with that speed limit that you're looking for, that complements the vision and the development patterns that are going to be happening there. Because I think that communication, that coordination, I think we could work on that, and we can have that hopefully results in a better product and a better project with that State Street project. So I would just hope that we can leverage this conversation and lead that into the State Street project.
Right, and one of the things that I've asked for around this one is from your staff and your team, those tools. So as we want to be mindful of the fact that ACHD and ACHD's team are the street designers, managers, maintenance keepers, etc. So I would like our staff to be supportive in sharing the goals that we have, and really look to you all, as I said last week before you reconsidered, to demonstrate the data that helps us understand that a change that's different than what was already proposed would meet our goals.
Mm-hmm.
The design features that your team would propose in designing streets as they do to meet the goals that we have as a city, I think is the appropriate way for our agencies to work together.
Thanks for that feedback. Sure, Goldthorpe.
Yeah, I think that, as I mentioned last week, every single one of the questions that we had or that was discussed about changes on that particular project could have been done and could have been accommodated within the budget that we had already set. And so in a perfect world, I would much prefer that somebody asked for our decision to be reconsidered and then took our staff up on those claims and made sure it happened.
Mr. Hanson.
Yeah, so thanks, Madam Mayor. And there's one thing I just want to clarify. I think we're hearing two things. One is the city needs to make it clear what their vision is for that area, and that includes the streetscape designs. And I know that when we were dealing with the DBIP, it was about maintenance, and there wasn't any increased lanes on any of the streets, including State Street, when it was discussed 10 years ago. But 5 lanes came in because of what was perceived as crashes on 13th, on mostly fender benders as people stopping. But we didn't really reevaluate that. We didn't evaluate that. We also did 2 major things since then. One is we converted Jefferson Street to 2 ways, so it functions in just 1 block away. And we also did Whitewater Park Boulevard. And its function, the whole purpose of Whitewater, which started out as the 30th Street extension, was to encourage people who were going to the south part of downtown to get off of State Street and come down Whitewater. But because we haven't made any changes on State Street, they continue to come in and on the net. And so level of service or the activity on Whitewater is still pretty low. So we haven't done any of that analysis. So I would hope the city, as we go in and dive into the details and say, given the changes that are taking place on Jefferson and other downtown streets, Whitewater Park Boulevard, the effectiveness of the 27th Street design, which the city was very instrumental in helping us push for, was controversial because the perception of going from 4 lanes to 3 lanes wasn't going to work, and it actually works much better. All that has happened in the interim to use that to then evaluate this. And so that's what I would ask the city to say, you do have a role in helping to develop design on what would be a critical, 5 blocks, 10 blocks, no, it's about 6 blocks, 8 to 15.
Madam Mayor, President Pickering, I agree with what the mayor said. I also agree with what Commissioner Nancy said, because there's something that's very different that's happening in this area. When the original design came through, and that like the 11th Street area is going to be completely transformed with the YMCA project, with the 11th Street Bikeway. We've got a new development that's coming in on 16th Street that's multifamily, designed around walking and biking. We've got another new development that's happening, I believe it's 9th and State Street, where the bank is, the Mid-Century Bank. And that is going to set a precedent, 8th, that's going to set a precedent there for making sure that the downtown and north end are connected, the way that people move to and from, and it also means that there'll probably be other future development on the other side of State Street as well. So we know that this is going to become one of the most heavily used pedestrian areas in the downtown area, where people are living and then walking or riding to where they're needing to go. And so, yes, I think we do need to rely on ACHD staff, but we know that nobody wants to walk across the 5-lane road, and that it's not the best day for a pedestrian to do that. We know that we need better speed. We know that we need better crossings. To your point, like, what are the Vision Zero things that we could put in there? And so I do think that this is an opportunity to do it. And I think that like ACHD staff needs to be very, very informed that we've just approved these developments. There's more to come, and every single one of them has parking reductions to try to get people to walk and ride more to the places where they're going to go, to encourage that lifestyle. And so, yeah, putting in a potentially 5-lane high-speed road or something like that in the middle of it isn't going to help achieve those goals.
And just a reminder, it is a major transit corridor, and we've invested a lot of money in that, so whatever happens has to ensure that the transit still works.
Absolutely.
Madam President, Mayor McLean, one more thing that I would add, and I think to Commissioner Goldthrop's point, I also think that we're probably in universal agreement that we want to see things move forward as fast as we possibly can, and for this not to be held up or delayed, if we can prevent that from happening.
Yeah, I've got to step out. I actually think that what you said was just better stated than what I was trying to say. Because we have a vision for this area. There is going to be future development. We ought to be talking, but I do think that it is not and cannot be just on the city to say, here's the plan we want, that our teams have to work together on this so that we're doing this in agreement and collaboration, because ultimately we rely on your agency to help make it happen.
Well, I think with that, we could probably just adjourn.
Okay, all right. Thank you all.
Thank you.